All right, so let's say that your UI is all done and your wireframe is something you're happy with and you want to move on to making it in Unity. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just start a new scene to work on this from. So I'm just going to go ahead and create scene. I'm just going to call this new UI scene, since this is simply a tutorial, but I'm sure you will have something much more relevant to call it. Now we have this blank scene. What I'm going to go ahead and do is just right click on it in the hierarchy window and create under UI a canvas. Now, this is your most important thing when making a UI. Everything else is pretty self-explanatory and can be used and modified however you need it to be, but you can't start making those assets until you have a canvas in your scene. Now this canvas is just a flat imaginary 2D plane that exists in your 3D scene and allows you to add all of your elements onto it, and it will be your main functionality for your UI. Don't worry too much about all of these things that are going on in the inspector for the canvas. All you need to know is that you need to have it. And once it's created, we can click on that again, right click it, and go down to UI and create a button. Now, this button I'm going to make in Text Mesh Pro. And Text Mesh Pro is an incredibly powerful tool that helps keep your fonts and your text looking sharp and crisp. Now, as soon as you go to create a Text Mesh Pro object like I just did, it will give you a prompt to import some packages. And I want you just to go ahead and import all of those. And that's just going to allow Unity to use Text Mesh Pro correctly and let your buttons and everything stay smooth. And just to make this quite clear on why that's important, I'm going to go ahead and move that button up. And I'm going to add another button that does not use Text Mesh Pro. And you can see that even at its default size, that text is a lot fuzzier than this one. And the reason for that is the Text Mesh Pro uses an SVG type system for handling its text, while the default Unity uses just a bitmap. We've talked about this a little bit in our previous tutorials. I believe it was the Illustrator one where I mentioned this and the differences between bitmaps and SVGs. But the most important thing to know about that is SVG preserves sharpness. So you're going to get a lot more clarity out of your Text Mesh Pro. It's just the standard way of rendering text now. So I'm going to go ahead and move that back. So the native tools in Unity are, they're totally usable, and you can just go ahead and modify everything you have there. However, if you have a design already, there are going to be several things you're going to need to do to get that implemented fully. So for right now, you'll see that this button has several objects underneath it, mainly just this Text Mesh Pro. Now this is going to be your just your text. So right now it just says button, which is pretty simple, but you'll notice that it has a font asset here. And now let's say that I want something other than these fonts that are already here. I've gone ahead and made a folder in my assets folder that's just called fonts. You can see I already have audio white in there. However, I think I want a different font. So I'm going to go to my font folder that I already have in on my computer. And I believe it's data fonts. Here we go. Let's say I want Sin Antique, as that was one of the ones that I used in my XD video. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag and drop this right into fonts. Now you'll see it makes one of these. That's just like the two A's right next to each other. However, we need it to be a Text Mesh Pro object. So I'm just going to right click on this, and there should be a way just to create a font asset from Text Mesh Pro. And as you can see, since I right clicked on the font asset itself, when I went through the drop down menu, I got to Text Mesh Pro and it just went ahead and made it for me. So you don't have to worry about all of these generation settings and stuff. It's a pretty good tool that already handles that sort of thing. But now you'll see when we go into our font assets and our hierarchy and stuff, right here, where it says Liberation Sans, we can go ahead and click the little target button and select Zen Antique, and it will change to that font. Unity comes prepackaged with a couple of them, like Bangers, I believe is one, Anton, Audio Wide is the one I imported. All of these are default though. So if you already are using like Roboto or something, then it shouldn't be an issue. But it is incredibly easy to import these into Unity. I'm going to stick with Zen Antique since that's the one that I used for XD. And we can go ahead and just mess with some alignments and stuff here just to get it lined up. Perfect. Now let's say I want to change the color of that text. It's called vertex color, but we can pretty easily just select what we have or paste in a hexadecimal code or something. But let's say we want to do a color gradient. This four corners gradient is probably going to be your best one. It's the one that I found actually works. Some of the other ones get a little bit funky, but you can just select some different colors. I'm going to stick with green for some reason, since that's what I already chose. I might as well just stick with it. Go ahead and double down on my less than ideal design choices, let's say. This is more an example of what you can do with the tools as an example of what you should be doing with the tools, because honestly that gradient is not fantastic, but you can see that it is drawing from all the colors that I put into the gradient and is displaying them over our text. So there's a lot of options that you can mess with here that will help you align your button style to however it was in your wireframe. And this is where having that wireframe comes in, because it's a lot easier to make these decisions using a program that is specific to these UI elements than it is trying to get Unity to work exactly how you want it to right out of the gates. Okay, so let's say that we're happy with that text for whatever reason, and we can move on to editing the button itself. Now, this button that we have is pulling from the default Unity sprite, and as you can see down here at the bottom, the default Unity sprite is just a little rounded square with a little bit of a highlight on the top that is then cut up and stretched to make an entire button. And this thing down here, it is 32 by 32 pixels, and you can make a PNG image of the same size and then import it in and slice it up in that way. I will get to that when I talk about, I will get to that in a little bit. I'm going to demonstrate some things in Illustrator when we do that. I'm just telling you that's an option right now. So if you have a specific button style, that's probably your best way to go about doing it. You can use the default Unity buttons and UI elements. However, they're not very exciting, and pretty much the most you can do is change font and colors. So any colors that we select here, I'm going to go with like a very light blue. No, that's not good. Maybe like a cream color. Sure, that's not bad. But that's just going to kind of overlay on top of what the button already is. So if you import your own, you might want to keep that in mind. You'll either want to make it the exact color you want right out of the gate, or you want to make it white so that you can easily edit what the color is going to be, because the color you choose in Unity is just going to render right over the top of that PNG. And I specify PNG because that's the file format that has the most, it is both transparent and a bitmap. And as of right now, Unity does not fully support using SVGs, although it might in the future. So you will get a little bit of this artifacting that I was talking about in the text options on the edges of your buttons, but at a full size that shouldn't really matter quite nearly as much as it does with the words. So if we drop down this button, you can see we have some other options on color transitions. So right now it just has like the default options, and I'll show you what that looks like if we go into the game and we hit play. When I click on this button, even when I mouse over it, you see it can go to a much darker gray. So it's just overlaying this highlighted color, pressed color, disabled color, selected color, all of that on top of the button. And these are just different shades of gray. That is something you might want to think about, maybe talk to your artist about if you aren't the artist who's implementing this. If you're like a programmer or something, that's something that you should probably mention to them, as they might have a color palette you can already pick from. But for me, I'm just going to select the color I already had and just drop it down so it sort of matches what Unity already had. And again, this is not going to be the prettiest thing I've ever made, but it is going to be a decent demonstration of these tools. Okay, that's good enough for me. So I'm going to go back to the scene view. And so we've got this button here, but I think we can add more to our canvas. So under UI elements, we have several things. We have like just the text, an image, a raw image, the buttons, toggles, slide bars, scroll bars, drop downs. A lot of these things you probably don't have to worry about. They're pretty self-explanatory and work in a very similar way as the buttons do. So if you're comfortable using the buttons, everything else should be just fine. Again, I would recommend using Text Mesh Pro for everything though. If you have like a big logo, you might want to import it as an image, and then your text, if you don't have a logo, you could just use Text Mesh Pro, just like we did on the button. And that is going to just render the same way. And you have all of these options for size, bolding, everything that you would expect to see in any sort of word editing. So let's talk about importing images. But first, let's talk about our buttons. So let's say we wanted to import an actual image like they have on this sprite, which could be cut up and sliced and stretched to whatever size of button you need. Again, you're going to want to make it at this 32 by 32 size. However, it might also be a good idea if you have like a different interesting design element to make, to decide exactly how big your button and everything needs to be, and then build it based on that. Here in a minute, I'm going to open up Illustrator and show you exactly what I'm talking about, and then how to actually import these sprites. Okay, so I just wanted to demonstrate sort of what I was talking about. So this is a UI that I drafted up for a game that I made, sort of a personal project, but I thought it was an important instance of what I mean by like shapes that normally wouldn't fit in with Unity's like way of cutting sprites. So as you can see in Unity, it's divided into like 9 equal spaces. But however, the other artist on this team, she drafted up some shapes that wouldn't really split up like that. So I've made them in Illustrator, and I've included a few design elements that wouldn't be repeatable. But as you can see, I have screenshots of exactly the size the game is going to be, to which I sort of compared the things I was making to make sure that they fit and worked. And I have this mock-up using some of the hand-drawn art versus the vector graphics that I've made in Illustrator. So how would we actually go about implementing this? I've gone ahead and drafted up just a couple little UI elements, just sort of based on the Pet Connect app I made, quote unquote, made in XD, using the same, like, at least the same colors. So I just wanted to say, like, as you can see here, just to demonstrate the power of PNGs, this little thing right here is translucent, so even though it looks the same on the white with the sage and the spring bud right next to each other, if you pull it onto the darker gray, you can see that its sage background is more, it's transparent, so you can see through it, and it changes color a lot more drastically. And then this object right here is not one that we could easily be divided up and stretched without losing its like 45-degree angle. So I'm going to go ahead and select this little guy. Since it's 2 separate objects, I'm going to right click it and just collect for export as a single asset. And then this one I'm going to just collect for export again, as a single asset, although it does not matter quite as much. So this one I'm going to call button sprite. And this one I'm going to call static sprite or something. Okay, so right now it's at some interesting scales here, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete them both, or at least add another one, or maybe not. So we're going to do a width of, actually let's do it in height. That makes the most amount of sense, since the static sprite has a fixed height instead of a fixed width. Let's say the other one was 32 by 32 pixels. I am not a fan of going with the smallest possible number, so I'm going to say 120. That seems like a reasonable size for this sort of button. Okay, cool. So I'm going to select them both, and I'm going to go ahead and export. And this is going to pull up where it wants me to export it to. As you can see, it's trying to export to the game I just showed you, but I think I'm just going to export it directly into wherever I saved this at. Okay, so I've gone ahead and saved it to the same file that my Unity stuff is saved in, and I'm going to open up Unity again. So I'm going to go back to my assets folder, and I'm going to make another folder inside of this for just my button assets. So I'm going to just call it UI assets and open it up. I'm going to go ahead and once again go through the same nonsense that I just went through to get where I saved it to. Okay, so I'm just going to drag and drop these back into here like I did last time. And now for the important things. So what we're going to do is I'm going to select them both. And see how it says texture type up here? I'm going to go ahead and hit Sprite, 2D, and UI. This is going to be incredibly important. You cannot use these in your canvas as UI elements if it is not selected as your texture type, Sprite, 2D, and UI. Okay, perfect. And I'm just going to hit apply. And now they will work. So I'm going to go back to our canvas, back to our button. And let's say I want this to, instead of that, to be something else. So our source image, it says UI Sprite right now. We're going to hit button sprite instead. And as you can see, the wrapping is super weird. We're going to select our mesh type as full rect, and then we're going to just hit the sprite editor and apply any unsaved changes. Go ahead and download that, what it just asked you to download for the package manager. Okay, so I guess we'll go through how to download things for the package manager. Okay, window, package manager, excuse me. We are going to look for 2D sprite editor. Packages, Unity registry. 2D sprite right here. Go ahead and install that. And all this is doing is just installing the package into our current Unity project. It is not installing anything spooky onto our computer. Okay, cool. Now that that's done, we can actually slice our sprite. So, sprite editor. We're going to do something called 9 slicing. So, we're just going to drag our borders until we like where they're at. What I'm trying to do is clip this 45-degree angle without actually messing with it. I'm just going to see what that looks like on our pixel-wise over here and choose a nice number. That's perfect. And just put all of our borders as being the same. Oh, 25. Okay, so now you can see that our big interior here is uniform, and then all of our corners are separated so that they won't be scaling quite the same. Okay, I'm gonna hit apply. Okay, so once our button is all sliced, how we're going to handle this is we're going to go into our button in our canvas. We're going to go down to image type, and we're going to select sliced instead of simple. And now this pixels per unit multiplier, this is just a little slider that we are going to just mess with until we are comfortable with how it looks. So you'll see at a certain point it stops stretching the image, but I'm going to just push it a little bit further so that those corners are a little bit more subtle. Cool, now our button looks how we want it to. So now if we save and then play it, we should be able to click on that. And because I used very similar colors when I first set up, okay, I've got to stop playing because if you make any edits while it's still playing, they won't save. So that's just a quick pro tip that will catch you every time. But even with this new sliced image, I still have all of these things for highlighted color, press color, selected color, still working beautifully. So now let's say I wanted to use my static sprite. So I'm just going to make a copy of this button. I'm going to just call it button 2 in the Text Mesh Pro, but first I'm just going to move it off so you can see it as a different thing. Button 2. And then we're going to just change this button sprite image to the static sprite. And this one is just going to be a simple one. But let's say that doesn't quite work. We can go into our text and we can just do smaller button or something. And by that I mean I'm going to drop the font size until it fits and just sort of mess with our Text Mesh Pro like we would any other text box to make everything fit. So that is how I would do a button that I have a very select style for that can't easily be converted into a 9 sprite. And this is how I would do a button that has a very consistent styling and can be used rather modularly, meaning that it can be used in a bunch of different contexts and be changed to fit what it needs to.